It's been a while. I left you guys on a cliffhanger for 4 days or so, and I apologize. Your fingers must be hurting. Last time I checked in with you, we had just finished talking about Peter Strojnik, a lawyer who, after getting disbarred, is now back to filing abusive ADA lawsuits, and that's the bulk of what we're going to talk about today. But first, I want to talk about why I didn't release the cliffhanger part 2 the day after like I originally planned to. And it's because I got some reasonable criticism about my first video, which was essentially that when I implied that David Ritzenthaler wasn't disabled just because there was a video of him walking around isn't really fair and leads to a culture of judging disabled people on whether they look disabled. In fact, I invited a disabled person on my show to explain it better than I ever could.
I'm Jocelyn, and I was born with a spinal cord tumor. Complications forced me to use a chair by the age of 9, so I use a wheelchair full time now. In my experience, it's hard for the public to understand that people can be more disabled on some days than others, and often the folks who have disabilities that are variable, they face the most sort of overt public judgment. I just think it's really important for people to understand that it's not the public's place to judge whether someone has a disability.
And I totally agree with that. And I should have been more clear in the video and also been more clear with the audience that for the most part, individuals faking disability really isn't a thing. So bear in mind that everything we say on this video is not typical. You should absolutely, under no circumstances, be checking to see if somebody with a disabled parking sign on their car windshield is actually disabled in your mind because they're walking. Look, clearly there are conditions which vary day to day, and just because someone can walk one day doesn't mean that they're fully able to walk all the time and don't require mobility access. However, there is a time when it's materially relevant. And to talk about this, I invited on the other side of the story, aka the representative for the small businesses who have been sued by Peter Strojnik. This is Phil Stillman.
I thought his disabilities, just from the way they were written in the complaint, sounded not believable, shall we say.
Phil has no problem saying that he doesn't believe Peter Strojnik when he says that he has problems with walking around. But he doesn't say this callously. He says this because how the ADA works is that you need to have what is called an injury in fact.
One of the things you have to show in Americans with Disability Act litigation is that it's not a barrier in general, but it's got to be a barrier to you based on your own disability. So, for example, if you're blind, you can't sue a hotel or another business because the aisles are too narrow for a wheelchair.
And this is one of the things that Peter Strojnik has not been able to do. Stillman says he never has really told anybody what his actual problems are.
One of the problems that Strojnik had and for whatever reason refused to go into detail on was how his disabilities, what his disabilities actually were, and how he would be suing on let's say something that would affect someone in a wheelchair, but he's not in a wheelchair.
So this puts me in a really tough position because here I am wanting to make this video talking about this lawyer who's hustling hundreds of small businesses out of $1,000 settlements. But on the other hand, I'm having this conversation with this disabled person telling me, rightfully so, that, hey, disabled people shouldn't have to prove themselves to you. In fact, it's actually also part of the ADA.
We're caught in a bit of a tension here because my understanding of the ADA is that it also protects people with disabilities from having to have their disability validated for unnecessary reasons. So, for example, if that disability was schizophrenia, there's a lot of stigma, and I wouldn't have a good working environment if I had to tell everybody.
So I'm going back and forth between these two interviews, like, yeah, I kind of agree with you. No, well, I kind of agree with you. And that's what made this video so tough. And eventually I just decided to tell it in all of its nuanced goriness, which is, on the one hand, you shouldn't judge disabled people. On the other hand, sometimes when somebody's suing hundreds of small businesses, it might be worth looking at what their claim to disability is. And that's exactly what Stillman did. After learning that Strojnik had filed hundreds of cases that had been subsequently thrown out in Arizona and then he had been disbarred, he decided to check into Strojnik's claims of being disabled and went and captured video footage from when Strojnik visited the hotels. And here's what he found.
So I started getting video surveillance showing, him walking in with like a over the shoulder luggage and pulling a big bag and standing up just fine and walking over to the elevator. Then that was my first one from one of my clients, and that showed him checking in at the time when he's claiming that, he's disabled. And then I started getting some video from other hotels showing him literally walking all over the hotel, taking pictures, and no problems walking at all. So it's pretty clear now that it's just a fraudulent scheme.
Have you ever seen him on camera in a wheelchair, kind of wheeling around?
No.
But if that's not enough, he was actually asked to take an independent medical exam to determine what are his problems.
One of my colleagues, who also was handling one of the cases, forced him to an independent medical examination. And the report says he doesn't appear to have any problem walking or anything. So the independent medical exam report seems to support the fact that he doesn't have any problems that he claims to have.
So here we're left with a weird problem, where on the one hand, disabled people want to be rightfully let alone from constantly having to prove themselves or somehow prove that they are in fact as disabled as they claim they are. Because it is true that almost no one fakes disabilities. However, it is also true that almost is non-zero. So what's the answer? Well, it's a tough issue for sure, but Jocelyn says it should be done respectfully.
If in that state, the way compliance is done is that you have to be one of these people, then I do think there's grounds to prove to somebody, maybe not the public, maybe not the media.
Right.
Somebody.
At least maybe a judge or something like
Absolutely.
that.
So what's the result of all this, right? After all of it's said and done, who's actually winning here? Well, it's certainly not the small businesses, and it's also not the ADA. Both Jocelyn and Stillman say that it looks just bad for the ADA when things like this happen. The only person who seems to be winning is Peter Strojnik, who keeps pressuring businesses into settlements, and this has been profitable for him. In one file that I recently saw, this lawyer, who is totally disbarred, he can't seek attorney fees at all, has made over $200,000 in settlements, which is absolutely mind-blowing. But Stillman says it just only makes business sense. Most companies, they don't want to retain Stillman because he costs more than getting the settlement done.
Here's the business model. So you sue a hotel, and the first thing they do is they call a lawyer, say, hey, I got this ADA case, this guy's been disbarred, et cetera, what can I do? And the lawyer said, oh, no problem, send me a $10,000 retainer and we'll be off to the races. And the fact of the matter is that the client can settle these cases probably for $5,000. He's picked a sweet spot of finance so that it makes just more sense to not have someone like me on the job, but just, pay him money to just get rid of it.
It's kind of like protection money though, isn't it?
It's a racket. It's a protection scheme.
So where does that leave us? How do we solve that issue? Well, the solution Stillman came up with is surprisingly straightforward. Just notify the businesses before you sue. It's a condition that before you can sue somebody for ADA violations, you have to tell them that in fact they have an ADA violation. I know, sounds revolutionary.
I think that the best way to deal with these things is to make a requirement that they give before anybody can sue, that there are these issues. And if they remedy those issues, they shouldn't be able to sue at all.
And Jocelyn agrees, although she says that there's one thing to remember.
The key point here is there's always going to be bad people. Yeah. And those bad people can't be our excuse to alleviate every business person in the land from being from their legal obligation
to be compliant,
to include, I think it's like 20% of the population has a disability of some sort.
Well said, Jocelyn. And to both my guests today, Stillman and Jocelyn, I want to extend my thanks for lending me both of your expertise. And I apologize in advance that I know that this is not a perfect video. And I hope you guys understand that I'm doing the best I can to present these scams with as much nuance and empathy as I can. Now, please enjoy as Jocelyn tries to get me canceled on the internet.
Thanks for taking the time. Appreciate it.
Well, can I plug my channel?
Sure. Yeah.
Our channel is called GIMP Hacks, GIMPHACKS. It's okay to say GIMP. I say so.
I'm not going to say it.
Nice try, Jocelyn. You almost got me, but it's 2020 and it's the internet. I ain't taking no chances.
And don't forget to smash like and subscribe. Thank you.